Welcome to Temple University, Japan. Thanks for joining us. If you didn't get an invitation directly from us, do give us your business cards. There are boxes here. You can give them to me, and we'll add you to our email list. We have several events coming up until the end of this month. And then, as you know, in August, we're moving to Sangenjaya. We'll be on the campus of Showa Women's University, and we'll have an even bigger lecture hall. So I don't believe in long introductions because you didn't come to listen to me, but you came to listen to Pascal. So I'll just say we're extremely happy that Pascal agreed to speak on this topic. And he will lecture for about half an hour, and then we'll have our usual Q&A session. So without further ado, Pascal, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert, for the kind introduction, and for ICAS for hosting me, and for all of you for showing up, because I'm not used to this big crowd when I talk about neutrality, because usually there's three noses in the audience. So thank you very much for this. This topic here is basically what I wrote my dissertation about, which I finished a year ago at the National Graduate Institute. And I find it interesting because there is something about studying the Second World War, but looking at those who didn't fight. Which is probably also why this topic has not been explored yet, because when you study a war, you're usually interested in what happened in the war, not what happened around it. But my argument is that is actually wrong, because you lose something out of sight, and that is especially true for the case of Japan. So let me go through this and tell you what happened with the neutrals, who was neutral, and why it's actually a bigger topic than you might expect in the beginning. So let's see. Maybe the first thing that I just would like to put out here in order to get a few misunderstandings out of the way, which is a misunderstanding about neutrality, just like, what is it? What does it mean to be neutral? And being neutral is something quite simple. It's not being at war. I drew this diagram just in order to maybe make that clear. Neutral countries are not neutral towards other countries. They are neutral towards a conflict. Country A, belligerent 1 and belligerent B. A neutral country is not neutral towards the other countries. The neutral country is at peace with the other countries. While it is neutral towards the conflict that is going on between these belligerent countries, or the conflict that's going on between them. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because the idea is not that neutrals are caught in the middle, where they cannot move. Because you're neutral, so you're not supposed to move either this way nor the other way. You're just supposed to sit still and not do anything. That's not the position of what neutrals do, especially when things get hot in actual conflicts. Neutrals start to move very quickly and have a lot of diplomatic actions going on, which is why this is such an interesting situation for diplomatic historians like myself to look at, because suddenly things happen that you don't see during other moments. And that's also why I chose the title of this presentation that way. The neutrals in Japan during the Second World War were friends with Japan and with Japan's enemies at the same time. And that is kind of a position that then enables things to happen. But before we go into this debate, because I myself am Swiss, and maybe that explains why I study that. There is a couple of countries that, when you think about neutrals, that come to mind immediately. The first ones are probably these two, like Sweden and Switzerland, that are kind of the famous neutrals, right? The ones that you've got at the back of your mind when talk comes to that. But what I would like to emphasize in this talk is that when we talk about neutrality in the Second World War, it really all depends on the time and the war, actually, because the Second World War is a succession of different conflicts, not one. Because we tend to imagine, okay, Second World War was like two fronts, all encompassing everybody inside. No, that's not what happened. It was different conflicts in different areas, and neutrality is always directed towards conflict. So you have different forms of neutralities in that time period. So the other neutrals that are less well known of the Second World War are, for example, Spain and Portugal, that remained neutral during the whole time, although both of them under dictatorships, proving the point that you don't need to be a liberal democracy to be neutral. It works very well for dictatorships, just like today. Turkmenistan is one of the neutrals at the moment. Works just as well for dictatorships. You had Ireland that remained outside the war, and you had Turkey that didn't join the fighting, let's put it that way. But then there's others, and we must not forget about that. The most important, I would argue, neutral of the Second World War was the United States, that did not join the fighting, either in Asia, if you think about the war that Japan was waging with China, or even before, like the 1931 to 37 period after the Mukden incident. The US was neutral in that conflict. The US also remained neutral when the war in Europe broke out for 2 years. The US didn't join the European war. The US was attacked by Japan. And the US neutrality was ended by Japan. And one thing that is really fascinating is that this ended a very long policy. US neutrality is nothing weird. The United States was neutral for 150 years. George Washington was the first one in 1793 who proclaimed officially that from now on the United States, regarding conflicts in Europe, would keep to a neutral stance and would not join those conflicts. And oftentimes they didn't. I mean, the First World War was basically a 2-year exception to that. And then they went right back. And in the interwar period, the United States enacted 4 neutrality acts by Congress trying to bind the hands of Roosevelt. And all of that ended with Pearl Harbor, ended by yet another neutral country during the Second World War, which is Japan. When Hitler attacked Poland, Japan had was part of the tripartite pact, right, with Italy and Germany, but that pact mandated that the other members have to help if one of the 3 is attacked. It didn't go the other way around, so Hitler declared war on Poland and then France and Britain and so on from itself. So Japan was under no obligation to help, and it didn't. It officially remained and declared itself as neutral in the conflict in Europe. Of course, like politically, they were helping Germany with argumentation, but they didn't join the war. They remained neutral. And it gets even weirder because the largest neutral of the Second World War was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was neutral until 1945, which is really, really weird, right? Because we all know that it was attacked and was one of the major allies fighting the European theater. During that whole time, the Soviet Union remained neutral towards Japan. These 2 countries, until the 9th of August, remained neutral toward each other while they were fighting each other's friends at the other end of the globe. This is the picture. On the left-hand side, you can see Foreign Minister Matsuoka at the time in, I think this is the 13th of April, 1941, about 3 or 4 weeks before Hitler attacks the Soviet Union, signing a so-called neutrality pact with Stalin and his foreign minister, Mr. what is his name, Molotov, in Moscow. Which is a major stunt by Mr. Matsuoka because it basically meant keeping the Manchukuo and the whole Chinese side of Japan's conflict out of the reach of, safe from the Soviets, let's put it that way. And it was very important for Stalin as well because it meant that he could deploy more of his troops that he used here in the East towards the West, towards then what later became the Eastern Front in Europe, right? And this pact held until the 9th of August, 1945. And the 9th of August is the day of the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. On the 8th of August, the Molotov were told for the Japanese ambassador that from tomorrow we're going to be at war with each other. This is important for 2 reasons. One, and the more important one, is that it meant a lot to the Japanese government, especially the foreign minister in 1945, Mr. Togo, believed until the very end, until that declaration of war, that it would be possible to use the so-called good offices of the Soviet Union to negotiate to come to a negotiated peace agreement with the United States. He had sent ever since April, ever since April 45, he had sent like many requests to the Soviet Union for Stalin to actually help bring about a negotiated peace agreement and convince the Americans to sit down and hammer out the details. And we know today that Stalin read that note to his counterparts at Yalta in this in the Yalta conference where the big three met again, and Stalin was in front of Roosevelt and Attlee, not Churchill anymore, because the Brits just had a change of government, and he read out the note from the Japanese government requesting Soviet help with a peace agreement, and he at this meeting proposed to just ignore it, and the other two agreed, and thereby that was done. And Stalin never informed the Japanese government that he had agreed in Yalta to join the war against Japan, keeping them waiting, basically paying them back for the Russo-Japanese War, in which 40 years earlier Russia was like humiliated against Japan. So that's one. I mean, without the Soviet Union having this neutral position towards Japan, we might have seen a different strategizing in the highest circles of the Japanese government. Whether that would have led to another outcome or not, we don't know. But at least for Foreign Minister Togo, this was like a lifeline that he was clinging to. And let me read, I'll come back to the other picture in a second. Let me read this sentence that I found in one of the communications that the Swiss ambassador, the Swiss minister who was here. Switzerland didn't have an ambassador in Japan, they had a minister here, one level lower. And on the 13th of August, which is one of the days when everybody was waiting for the war to end, when everybody was waiting for the Japanese side finally to say we're gonna accept the Potsdam Declaration and the war is over, everybody was waiting. He was sending a cable back to Bern about what just happened a week earlier, saying that with the last illusion for the possibility of a prolonged resistance has disappeared after the Soviet declaration of war 4 days earlier, right? Which caused a real panic in the government, but which the press does not comment. Minister Togo, who was grossly wrong about the Soviet attitude, hastily returned to Karuizawa, literally shattered. And then he adds, composure cannot replace intelligence, which tells you a lot about what the Swiss head diplomat was thinking about Togo, about Minister Togo. But it also tells us something about how incredibly strong that belief was. So this is one of the important things. The other thing why this matters is that because of that neutrality agreement, you had for the entire time of the war a Soviet ambassador in Tokyo. This is a picture of Ambassador Malik. And if I'm not wrong, he was actually the only ambassador of a neutral country, because all the other countries had only ministerial level relations, which is basically a thing of the past, right? When only great powers would exchange ambassadors, and if you're not a great power, you would only be allowed to send a minister, and a diplomatic minister. So of course not a state minister, but a diplomatic minister to do your diplomatic dealings. And this shows him in a picture of the Yomiuri Shimbun in 1944 with the caption there. The foreign minister Shigemitsu at the time, this man here, invites a representative of neutral countries back to his mansion for a dinner, and he stands there together with the Swiss ambassador and with the Swiss minister and the Swedish minister. So as weird as it sounds, even for diplomatic reasons, for the diplomatic world, the Soviets were fairly and squarely a neutral country towards Japan. Minister Gorge, the Swiss guy, in his memoirs calls this the strangest neutrality one has ever seen. But for diplomatic purposes, it did do the same thing as it did for the others. So Who were the others, though? I mean, as I said, also Turkey and Ireland were neutral, but Ireland was just in the 1920s basically became a nation, and by the 1930s and 40s didn't have a large diplomatic service yet, so they had no representation here in Tokyo. Then the other ones that remained neutral were Sweden, Spain, and Switzerland. Portugal was also here, but I must say that diplomatically, the most important jobs that then were done during the Second World War were done by these three, which is why I'm going to focus only on them. And it's an interesting lineup, right? Again, two democracies with a fascist dictatorship, but for diplomatic purposes, they were able to do the same things. They were able to maintain their ministers in Tokyo. And one of the reasons why this caught my interest was because if you study the neutral countries in Europe, what you usually talk about is how horrible the situation was, you know, surrounded by belligerents, threatened by basically any one of them. I would just like to call to your attention that the only war damage Switzerland sustained during that time was inflicted by the Americans, who mistook one of the Swiss towns for a German town and bombed it. So any one of the belligerents was actually quite a threat, also for Spain and for Sweden, and Iceland was occupied by the British because it was a necessity. So this is usually, and of course, like Germany and Italy were threatening both of them. I mean, Spain and Switzerland could have been invaded at one point or another, and that's usually the debate that happens. The other thing that you discuss is the economic dependencies that you had of the like surrounding belligerents. Let's just look for 1 second at these at an example of 1938 for Swiss trade and its import numbers. 23% of Swiss imports came from Germany, 7% from Italy, 14% from France, 6% from Great Britain, 8% from the United States, which means, of course, that these countries that surround you and that all became, well, enemies towards each other, were all important. You cannot just cut off 23% of imports, especially when it's foodstuffs, without causing real serious trouble to like keeping your population alive. For Japan, the question is completely, utterly different, right? 0.75% of imports coming from Japan and 2.5% going there, meaning that, you know, trade with Japan was there, it existed, but it wasn't vital. And Japan was definitely too far away to ever pose, under whatever scenario, a military threat to any of these three countries. And in that sense, what I was wondering is, okay, it makes complete sense for neutral countries in Europe, or for these three small countries, to maintain a very active diplomacy with the other European states, because they're a threat, like economically and militarily. You need to maintain an exchange, right? It makes absolute sense. But with Japan, we know that the diplomats here were actually asking their governments, shall we just go back in 41, right after Pearl Harbor? Shall we pack up? I mean, the Swiss, they had 200 odd people here, expats, mainly working in heading Swiss companies, and 5-6 diplomats or people working at the embassy. You could have evacuated those and just left in 41. That was a possibility, but they decided not to. And long story short, let me give you for the Swedes and for the Swiss, these sentences that I found in their diplomatic cables, which I found tell you a lot. For the Swedes, it's the Swedish minister who wrote back to his government that total evacuation seems excluded considering the financial interests of companies. Now, my gut feeling that trade over here didn't matter was wrong. It wasn't huge, but there was trade going on, and there was economic interest over here. And the Swedes decided, yes, I mean, why would we leave? Why jeopardize that? The Swiss said it even more outspokenly. This is from a report of the Swiss legation that they sent back to Switzerland that reads, "The Department of Foreign Affairs has repeatedly insisted on its viewpoint that in regard to the time after the war, it should be avoided to voluntarily abandon cumbersomely gained positions. it is preferable to patiently and bravely wait for the arrival of more favorable times. And that's pretty clear. It's the strategy is quite simple. I mean, we're neutral, we're not at war, sit it out and wait. We don't know how this is going to finish. And this makes complete sense if you just think about the fact that, okay, you don't know how the war turns out, right? Just as little as you would like withdraw your diplomats from the United States, you would also not withdraw your diplomats from Japan right after Pearl Harbor, because you don't know what's going to happen. B, you have such a long relationship with this country. This just wouldn't make any sense. And that's the strategy all of them followed, including the Spanish. And that led to this situation where you now had countries that were at peace with Japan, who were helping Japan diplomatically and helping the United States at the same time. What does that mean? There is this weird situation that even during war, countries that fight each other still sometimes have common interests. And they want not only to talk to each other about these interests, they also want to organize things together. One of the most straightforward issues to tackle when you declare war is, what do you do with the enemy nationals? So Pearl Harbor, the bombs drop, the information is then transmitted to the ambassador, to Ambassador Grew of the United States, that from now on there's a state of war, and then Ambassador Grew's embassy compound was surrounded by Japanese military police, and from now on these diplomats are enemy nationals, still under diplomatic protection, and the embassy is still US soil, but they are now prisoners, and all of the US nationals in the Empire of Japan have to be interned, and because they are now national security threats. And the same in the United States, right? The Japanese ambassador becomes an enemy national, and internment starts. But you want them back, right? You want your own people back, and the others want their people back, so you have a common interest. But how do you do that when you only communicate through gunfire? Well, you ask a common friend, and that's what they did. This is diplomatic practice. When you break relations, be it because of war or because of, well, you just don't want to talk to them anymore, like what's happening right now between Iran and the United States, you actually ask one of the neutral countries, or one of the countries that has still friendly relations with the other one, to render what's called the protective power mandates, or good offices. And in the Second World War, this, because due to the sheer spread of war relations between all of these belligerents, you had a lot of protective power mandates that needed to be filled, and it turns out that Sweden, Spain, and Switzerland were the three most used protecting powers, and that's especially true for Japan. So this map here shows you the protection of Japanese interests abroad, meaning the flags of Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain show you in which countries these neutrals represented Japanese interests. This, for example, shows you that who did Tokyo ask to help them in the Americas? Tokyo asked Spain, can you please represent us in the United States? Can you help us to get our people back? And you're the communicator. And they did so also for the whole South America. Basically only Mexico, they asked Portugal, because Mexico had a really, really bad grudge against Franco's regime. They basically were supporters of the Republicans back who lost the Civil War. So only for Mexico, the Japanese asked Portugal to help them there. And in the rest of the, in other parts of the world, especially in the UK, but also especially like Australia and the Dominions, and basically the former British Empire, Japan asked Switzerland, please help us there and protect our people and be our communicator with the enemy government. And Sweden as well was serving over time. The most interesting place where Sweden actually was helping Japan was in Hawaii. Why? Because the Spanish didn't have a consulate there. But Japan had a lot of nationals in Hawaii, so they were really, really keen on having one of the neutrals helping them there and protect their interests, and the Swedes did that, which is why it became a really difficult feat to actually organize these transport of civilian and diplomatic personnel back and forth, which they later did, because you had to involve so many neutral countries in these negotiations, because this goes both ways. If you declare war on another state, you're free to ask any neutral you want. So the Japanese decided to ask Spain in the Americas to help them out, but the Americas kind of didn't really trust the Spanish. So the mirror image is, of course, the protection of enemy interests in Japan, which allied countries asked which neutral to help them in Japan. And you see, it was Switzerland. The United States asked Switzerland, please help us in Tokyo. So did Canada, and basically only Paraguay asked Spain, can you help us in the United States, which maybe has to do with the fact that they had one single Paraguayan passport holder in Japan who also happened to be Swiss at the same time. So it didn't really matter. But for all the ones that mattered, you basically had Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland who did the diplomatic networking and the back and forth with Japan. And this picture changed, of course, over time. This is an approximate snapshot of mid-1942 as the war progresses and as more states declare war on Japan. You have more protecting power mandates that then that are being requested. I mean, even the Soviet Union in the end asked on the 9th of August 45, they asked Sweden, can you please protect us? That's just something you do. And that's something that the neutral countries just provided. Now, what was that? I mean, these exchange ships were probably the most important job they had to do. There's several thousand, close to more than 10,000 people were exchanged between the Allies in 3 batches of ships that were organized and then marked with the Red Cross or White Cross or anything that would identify them as sailing under the protection of a negotiated deal, because this was a negotiated affair of how to exchange these people. This was not a one-way thing. Both Japan and the Allied countries all agreed on the route to take, how many people, what status, even who would be sleeping in what kind of cabins. All of that, all of those details had to be organized, which also then led to a tremendous increase of capacity that was necessary here in Japan. And for both Sweden and Switzerland, they hired a lot of nationals, which is really interesting. The Swiss legation at that time was 6 people strong in 1941 and 52 people in 1945, just because they had to hire so many people into their service in order to organize these kind of things. The exchange ships are one. The other thing is visiting prisoners of war camps. So this picture here shows you 2 Swiss delegates of the Red Cross, and also affiliated to the Swiss legation, visiting one of the civilian internment camps in Tokyo. And that is where I just would like to remind us all how incredibly close this event is. This man here is Harry Angst, who used to be the head of the Siebner company over here, Sieber-Hegner. And we have another former Sieber-Hegner boss right here with us who was working under Harry Angst in the 1960s. This is how close we are to this moment. This is a picture taken in 1944. In the end, the Swiss and the Swedes were able to visit around 1/3 of all the internment camps in the Japanese Empire. They couldn't go abroad. They couldn't go to any of the territories that were occupied by the Japanese, because Japan did not recognize the neutral diplomats to extend their mandates all over there, in breach of tradition. But at least inside Japan, they were able to visit these camps, distribute money, because as weird as it sounds, but even in internment camps, you still need money to buy food, and they would then distribute money that they got wired to Japan, all electronically through a telegraph. There was a whole exchange mechanism that they set up in order to get Japanese funds in return for Swiss and francs and kronas, and then distribute that to the nationals under their protection. And I think I already have to come to a close because my 30 minutes are going to be up. In conclusion, when it comes to the small power neutrals, what my conclusion is that it's this mandate, it made sense for them to remain engaged in Japan during the war. And on the other hand, leaving Japan, as I originally thought, why did you not leave? That would have been weird, because you're not at war. So why would you actually go unless you're really in danger, which was not the case until it was too late. In 44, 45, it became dangerous, and they were evacuated to Karuizawa, but in Karuizawa, no diplomat came to harm. So Japan actually did a pretty decent job to keep foreign diplomats safe. Japan was not a vital trading partner to any of the small neutrals, but it was an important one. My initial slide was also kind of misleading in that sense, because Japan to Switzerland and Sweden was basically as had the same trade volume like Holland or Portugal. You know, it's not huge, but it's like one of the other European countries. So why would you forego economic relations if you don't have to? If Japan had been successful with its war, it would have become the gatekeeper to Asia. That was clear from all the diplomatic cables in 1941. You really didn't know how this would play out. And it would be absolutely clear that if Japan succeeded in building its co-prosperity sphere, the only way to have relations with the Philippines and with other Asian nations would be through Japan. So actually stick it out in Tokyo and wait. And this was just, there was just no reason for a rupture of relations. And then in turn, that meant that if you don't rupture relations, you actually, if you get friendly requests from Japan, please help us abroad, you do that. And if you get friendly requests from abroad, from the enemy countries, help us, you do that too. And then you become what I call diplomatic service provider of last resort. And that's basically the story that I had to tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pascal. So the rule is, if you have questions, raise your hand, and then you can come up here so that we can hear you from the microphone. Let me take the advantage of controlling the microphone to ask the first question. There's one additional neutral European power, which is the Vatican. What role did it play, being both a temporal and spiritual power, being a unique state in many ways?
The Vatican is highly interesting because it's tiny, of course, surrounded by Rome, but it really had a large diplomatic service, extending all the way to Japan, having a diplomatic nuncio over here. And the Vatican, of course, had no trade interests with Japan, but the Vatican had Christianization interests. And not only Japan, but the territories that Japan occupied. One of the major issues since 1931 to the Vatican, what happens to these Christian, these Catholic denominations in China or in Manchuria that are now suddenly under Japanese control? That was a serious issue to them, and they were actually seeking closer relations with Japan even at that time, and only got these better relations in 1942, in January 1942, when the Japanese offered, why don't we send you a diplomat permanently stationed at the Vatican? Wouldn't that be nice? The Vatican said, like, oh, thank you, yes, let's do that, because then we have a closer relationship. And the moment that happened, the Americans and the British couldn't believe it, saying, like, how can you extend more cordial diplomatic relations with Japan at this moment? And the Vatican was trying to gesture very much, saying that, look, we wanted these relations ever since 60 years ago, and now we're getting them, which of course fell on deaf ears. But luckily for them, the Chinese government in Chongqing, there was there was support. Under Chiang Kai-shek, yes. The Chiang Kai-shek's government that was not recognized by Japan, but was supported by the Allies, of course, in 42, then asked also to send a representative to the Vatican, and the Vatican gladly accepted and said, yes, please. The more relations, the better, which on the other hand, then the Japanese government protested and said, how can you recognize an unrecognized state? So the Vatican was very deeply involved in Asia in trying to extend its relations without causing any major fallout with any of the two sides. So something the Vatican, for example, didn't do, and which is often claimed, and it's just wrong, they never recognized Manchukuo. The baseline was, we will not recognize any change of territory brought about by force. Before this is not agreed, so they never recognized Manchukuo, but they invited the official governments to have closer diplomatic relations.
Thank you. So, Ken?
Ken Moskowitz here at Temple University. Pascal, you covered very well the situation of the diplomats in Japan and other places. Did the Swiss or other neutrals do anything for American citizens in Japan or the Japanese territories? And I'm thinking you may have seen the Ken Burns 6-part documentary called The War about World War II. There's an extended part which is very graphic about the situation of the American citizens or family anyway, in the Philippines. And how desperate it became over the course of the war.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the major issues that Gamigorje, the Swiss minister, for example, was trying to reach, which was to convince the Japanese government to recognize the right of neutral states to protect the interests of the enemy also on occupied territories, which was actually a diplomatic, that was normal. There was not a controversial request, but Japan decided no, the neutral countries can only represent enemy interests and guard them on the mainland, in the empire, on what was not at war before war broke out after Pearl Harbor, which had the effect that the Philippines were off limits, basically. The only place where Swiss nationals also lost their lives was in the Philippines, actually, to the Japanese army forces. So even they were not safe over there, but and even less, of course, the American and British civilians, or God forbid, captured enemy personnel. They were in very, very bad. They had no protections at all, and no. I mean, on the mainland, at least, they could try to get the ears of the Swiss or the Swedes, but in the occupied territories, no. The interesting side effect is that Taiwan was under the protection because it belonged to the Japanese Empire. So the Swiss actually were sent to Taiwan to close the US consulate there and make sure that everything went according to standards.
The icons of Switzerland and Sweden in those countries, then concretely, what did they do?
Concretely, what they did. Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain. I mean, they organized. Huh?
Spain and India, and in South countries, South American countries, and some other countries.
Okay, maybe this. I use this map just in order to show which countries that. On this map, for example, protection of enemy interests in Japan, so which countries or territories had diplomatic representation in Japan. It doesn't mean that the neutrals were here in South Africa doing things. This is like South Africa having officially, or South African nationals being under the protection of the Swiss in Japan. That's what it means. And some of these mandates were not substantial because there were just no nationals from these places in Japan at the time. I mean, for example, as I said, Paraguay really only had one single Paraguayan passport holder in Japan at the time, and the most Latin American countries had almost no interest in Japan. But The moment you issue a declaration of war, you also usually, just by a diplomatic etiquette, ask a neutral country to actually represent you in the other state. You kind of do this almost simultaneously. And all of them, they stick to these protocols. So, of course, a country like Australia had by far more interest in actually having a effective neutral helping them in Japan just for the sheer fact that you have nationals in the empire, and you might have soldiers who get captured, and you might have to lodge diplomatic protests. I mean, even during war, you still lodge diplomatic protests against the other government when they do something that's not in accordance to international law. For example, the bombings of cities. Japan lodged protest after protest through the Swiss and the Swedes saying, stop bombing our cities, that's against international law. Which it is, and which the Swiss then conveyed and said, yeah, the Tokyo is protesting against what's happening. It's like, and yes, I mean, it didn't change anything, but they were playing this role of talking to the other side because you don't talk to each other anymore directly. The question is, so there was communication between the Swiss government and Swedish government and the Japanese government going on? Yes, that happened. The Swiss and the Swedes and the Spanish, they had continuous access to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo. Even while they were exiled to Karuizawa to keep them safe, they had connections. And you must just imagine, okay, Japanese government wants to lodge a protest with in Washington. What happens? They call the Swiss minister, the ambassador, give him a note of protest. He brings it back. He cables it to Bern, and Bern then cables it to the United States. The United States is not represented by Switzerland, but by Spain. So they cable back to the Spanish minister to Madrid, Madrid then to his minister over here gives it to the Japanese government. That's the chain. But there is a chain, even though it's inconvenient, but there is a chain of communication.
Yeah, my name is Kurt Sieber. I was just shortly introduced. In fact, Harry Angst, who was shown on the picture there, he was my first boss when I came to Japan in 1960. Now, my comment on this is, when I came to Japan, the understanding of neutral was totally different from what you were just explaining. For the Japanese people who talked to me and listened to me, when I told them that before coming to Japan, I was 9 months in the Swiss military, and everybody said, well, you must be lying. I mean, neutral, that means your country has no army. And I said, no, that's not what it means. It has an army to protect its neutrality. That's my first comment. Perhaps talking about Harry Angst, one more thing. The company Sieber Hegner, which I mentioned, was founded in Japan in 1865. That sounds like Keogannen. And obviously, the company had a great interest after almost 80 years or so of existence in Japan and doing a lot of business in Japan at that time, to remain in Japan even during the war. And the only way of being able to do that was that Mr. Angst, besides running the business of Sieber Hegner at that time, he also was the delegate of the International Red Cross, as you know, which is located in Geneva in Switzerland. So that's my. By the way, after several mergers, Sieber Hegner now is one of the biggest trading companies in Europe with about 35,000 people all over Asia. So it really paid off to stay in Japan at that time. That was point number 2. Yeah, but point number 3 I have is a real question. Yeah, you mentioned, and please confirm if my understanding is correct. You said the USSR declared war on Japan on August 9, 1945. Is that correct?
The declaration was handed to Ambassador Sato on August 8, containing the information from tomorrow.
Yeah.
We will be at the state of war, in the state of war. So
Oh,
the
okay.
war started on 9th of August.
Now, this, as you know probably a lot better than me, is that this, even after more than 70 years now, is still a very hot subject in connection with the Northern Territories, where Prime Minister Abe has been making great efforts to try to somehow get them back to Japan, on the argument that Russia is occupied these territories, these 4 islands, or well, there are a lot of small islands there, but basically the 4 territories illegally, because it was not done during a war. It was just after the Japan conceded the loss of the war. Then the Russians took it over. What would be your comment about that argument? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a legalistic argument, because officially the neutrality pact between the USSR and Japan was still valid until April 1946. It was valid until 46, so the Russians actually handing this declaration of war was a breach of contract, if you want to put it that way. It's like you shouldn't do that. This is against what we've said. The Russian argumentation then was like, no, you are at war with our allies. It is like, yeah, I mean, they have been at war with your allies the entire time. Why now? That's exactly not what makes sense. But the argumentation is on the Russian side at that time was that actually the neutrality agreement became invalid the moment Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. That's the legalistic argument. The moment Japan attacked an ally of the Soviet Union, they invalidated that treaty. Okay, war didn't break out, but okay, that's your own, I mean, that's every country's decision. And then we decided sovereign right to make war on you. So the thing was invalid, and Japan says, no, we had a valid treaty. It's a legalistic argument, actually, and well, basically hair splitting, right? But that's the rationale behind that. The other things that you said are absolutely right. It paid off for Switzerland and for Sweden. Their companies remained here. You know, Siebner Hegner remained. The Swiss and the other diplomats actually had to leave Japan because the MacArthur, the occupation forces, forbid Japan from having diplomatic relations with other countries because, sorry, Japan, you're not sovereign anymore. Therefore, no more sovereign right for diplomatic relations. You have to close all of your diplomatic representations abroad, which they did, and you have to send back these diplomats, which then basically meant the Swiss were able to remain during the war, but during the peace they were expelled. But their companies weren't. So Siebner Hegner, and to get today's DKSH, right? DKSH, Siebner Hegner, yeah, is were able to do business again in 46, 47, 48. You must consider, though, that ever since late 1942, business in Japan basically went all the way down. I mean, Mr. Angst and others, they were basically out of a job because there was no more way to actually trade since the war cut all of these communication lines of communications, basically the sea lanes. And that's one of the positive side benefits about this mandates that they had. The Swiss ambassador, the Swiss minister was able to hire these people into his service in order to give them A, a job and money, B, diplomatic protection. Because it was running around in 1943, 44 with a white face in Tokyo was actually dangerous. Most people were fine. I mean, there was only one Swiss diplomat who was killed on the way back from Taiwan. The man who oversaw the closure of the American consulate was killed on the ship back. It was never found out what happened. It was just there was a lot of blood in his cabin, but nobody was found. So probably he was murdered by some rogue elements of the military police, which were most notorious about just being brutal. I mean, officially, Japan, the government level always tried to remain actually diplomatically within what's standard, what's usual for diplomats, but the military police is an entire different question. Was an entirely different question, but yes, it worked, and you're right. I mean, this company that he was running is one of the oldest that was founded, or the oldest. There were. Yeah, I mean that's a different story, but it's like these trade interests, they were old and they were maintained, and in the long run it did pay out, we must say, I would say. Yeah.
My name is Andre Zimmerman. I work for Lindt and Sprüngli chocolate company here in Japan. From all these services you were talking about, these neutral countries did for either part, I guess there is no freebie, so obviously America, United States, and Japan, they paid these neutral countries for their services. I never hear anything about payments.
The payments were fascinating. For one, because it almost entirely happened without cash. The Swiss and the Swedes both set up a clearing system using the Yokohama Specie Bank and the Swiss National Bank and the Swedish National Bank in order to create a mini clearing system between each other so that you could transfer funds, pay in Switzerland with Swiss francs, and the Swiss minister here would be able to get Japanese yen from the Specie Bank and then do like millions of today value Swiss francs that were transferred back and forth. One of the ways through which Swiss companies were able to repatriate some of their funds. That's what a clearing system is for. But on the other hand, it was also a way to transfer funds back to Japan in order to give the Swiss minister Camille money that he could distribute or use to buy food for his own legation and for the people under his protection. Which was really important. And the services themselves, what you do, that was basically for free. I mean, neither the Americans nor the British or the Japanese paid for like what we would call hourly fees. There were no timesheets kept. What you pay is the money that should be distributed. So the US transferred funds to Switzerland, which then were transferred to Japan in order for the Swiss to distribute in these internment camps, or whatever expenses they had to pay in order to get these ships up and running. There was a lot of money involved there, and these expenses were kept like to the yen, which was quite simple to do back then. And just a side note for anyone doing business, back in 1941, 42, 43, the exchange rate yen to Swiss francs was 1-to-1. That changed quite a bit, right? But that was the exchange rate. Same with the krona. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I decided to keep the majority of my savings in Swiss francs, because historically speaking, it's the safer bet. Sorry. Yes. The question is, why did Ireland and also Turkey and Portugal and Spain, Switzerland and so on remain neutral, whereas some others didn't? Is it based upon the philosophy or utility? What's the reason that these countries remained neutral and others not? Well, several answers. Some neutral countries were just overrun. Belgium, Holland, they were invaded by Germany in order to serve a purpose, right? Because they wanted a way to fight their war in Europe. Iceland as well. Iceland was neutral, but it was invaded by Britain. And the moment you're invaded, you're not neutral anymore. I mean, basically, you have a war as well. You're in the Second World War, and Japan back then had the habit of any country that's not sovereign anymore, their diplomatic personnel has to leave. Because, you're not sovereign anymore. So a lot of neutral countries in Europe were overrun. Small neutral countries, and lost their sovereignty. And then some decided to join because I mean, Britain declared war because Hitler attacked Poland, right? That was the moment when this whole thing broke. And Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, with which Germany had a non-aggression pact, similar to the Neutrality Pact. So I mean, some countries are drawn in because they're attacked, and the other countries, for them, it just doesn't. It doesn't make sense to join the war. I mean, for Switzerland, it would have been basically, let's say in 1940, it would have been suicide to declare war on Germany. I mean, why would you do that? This is nothing that furthers your goal as a state to keep your people safe. So you don't. And so that was also the case for Ireland, for example. The Irish just had zero interest joining a war on the side of Great Britain, from which it just gained independence 20 years earlier after very, very many bloody decades. So each country had its own rationale, its own reason. Spain and Portugal are interesting because their philosophy was much closer to the fascist philosophy of Hitler and Mussolini, right? But no gain. It's like there was a meeting between Hitler and Franco in the mountains, right, between France and Spain. La Haye, huh? Was it in Andorra? In a neutral country. Dear, sorry, but maybe La Haye or something it was called. There was a meeting, and Franco promised in 3 months they're going to join the war on your side. But in these 3 months, the Wehrmacht, the German army, had some losses, and Franco recalculated and said, nah, rather not so sure anymore, because there's, and nothing to gain, everything to lose. This is #NotMyWar, which is. No, seriously, in this day and age, remember that. Neutral countries are just saying that. This is #NotMyWar. And if you're not at war, you're at peace. And if you're at peace, then you do certain things. And that goes for the Swiss as well as for the Spanish. That's the whole rationale behind it. Yes?
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I lived in Switzerland for 20 years, so I kind of relate to this whole thing. But you may be biased, but any ranking on who to ask if in war, Sweden, Switzerland, Spain? Well, as any effectiveness ranking, just of course it's not rational, but in your terms, which provided the best services to those countries? No, okay, sorry. I mean, it's not best service. Go ahead.
It's a good question. No, seriously, it's a good question. Okay, let me give you several answers. So in terms of rankings, which ones were actually asked? Swiss, Sweden, Spain. Switzerland, Sweden, Spain. Those were the 3 largest protecting powers of the entire Second World War. I mean, not just for Japan, but for the European theater as well. In that sequence, and whom you ask depends largely on whom you trust most. The Japanese had most trust to Spain, just simply because ideologically they were closer, with Franco than they were with the Swiss. Plus, they really wanted to convince Latin American countries to remain friendly to Japan. So you actually ask somebody who's culturally closer to them. Makes quite a lot of sense. Quite reasonable. On the other hand, the opposite was true for the Allied countries. I mean, they really didn't. The United States, the United Kingdom, they really didn't trust Franco to remain neutral. So they said, let's ask the Swiss. And already at that time, the Swiss had more reputation for this because they did the same job, or similar job, in the First World War. So did the Swedes. So in terms of capacity, the Swedes and the Swiss were both better choices back then because more experience and diplomatic networks. Because it really, this is really important, right? I mean, that's why Hawaii, the Japanese couldn't ignore Hawaii and said, we need actually a neutral with a consulate. There needs to be capacity on the ground. Otherwise, it won't work because you need a job done. This is hands-on, which is also the reason why, in the end, the UK asked in the beginning of the war, in the first 2 months, the Great Britain actually asked neutral Argentina to help them in Japan. For what reason, I actually don't know. But the request went first to Argentina to represent them in Tokyo, but the Argentinians had one diplomat here and 3 or 4 civilians who could help, and there was just not enough. Camille, the Swiss minister, wrote in his diaries that after 3 months, when he was already with a staff of 20 people working day and night to organize these exchange ships for the Americans, the chargé d'affaires of the Argentinians handed to him the work that he did so far in one single binder. And he said he couldn't, I mean, it's like, poor Argentinian diplomat, of course you're overwhelmed, of course you can't do that. So capacity matters on the ground. And one of the things that is interesting for this is that it's not just the diplomatic capacity, but the network of companies on the ground, because people like Andre Zimmermann, you would have been hired instantaneously to become actually a first secretary of the legation and then do this work, because you didn't have enough diplomats here, but you had enough nationals whom you could convert and who would then have the right passport to actually enter these internment camps, which was quite important. So this is also a tale of public-private partnership during extreme times. How did Spain do in the US? The Japanese actually complained that the Spanish weren't aggressive enough to represent their interests, and complained, said you should be more like the Swiss. But in fairness, the Spanish ambassador in the United States actually tried quite a lot for Japan. So I'm not entirely sure if that criticism is justified. The criticism was also politically motivated because they were unhappy with Franco at what happened at the time when that was there. But all in all, I would say we all pray to God or the universe that this never happens again. If it does, ask the Swiss. Yes?
Yeah, just a short question. Hold on, just a short question to follow up. How did this play out in Bern itself? Because it must have increased the workload of the foreign ministry enormously. So were there also new hires at the Department of Foreign Affairs in Bern? I mean, how did they deal with the surge of work from, say, 1939, I guess, to 1945 back in Switzerland?
Go ahead. Answer his question.
Thank you. Yeah, a short answer, yes, they had to hire more people. And the thing is, the big change didn't come in 39. The big change came in 41 because the Japanese attack against Pearl Harbor knocked out one of the most important neutrals of the time, which was the United States. The United States was representing British interests in Germany, British interests in what was left of France and in Italy and so on. They had quite a lot of these protecting power mandates. And so not only did the US need their own protecting power, they also lost all of these mandates that then were given to basically Switzerland and Sweden. And that was the moment when this section of foreign interests in Bern really exploded, in a sense that, okay, there's now so much more to do. In 39 to 41, this section was created in 39 when the first requests came in with a couple of people. And then I don't remember how many, but it grew significantly. The number I have in my head now is 150, but I might be wrong. That's, but it grew, and also there's a report that they wrote at the end, which is interesting to see how everything developed, because you keep track of everything.
Can you hear me? Wouldn't you like to comment on two things? One, the transfer of nationals at Mozambique, or I believe it was Madagascar, where the Americans and the Japanese were transferred. and this was negotiated. And number two, the importance of the Swiss banking system during the war, because one person asked why Switzerland remained neutral. So it's without the banking system, I mean, I think this is at the heart of it. It would be good if you could comment on this.
Thank you very much for two very good questions. The first one, these exchange ships, where were they here? They had to go through quite a tedious route, because this ship left Yokohama and then would sail either to Mozambique. I forgot the name of the port. Either to Mozambique or to
Probably to Maputo, to Lourenço Marques. To
Lawrence
I mean, to Maputo now, yeah.
exactly. They would go there, and then the Japanese nationals. I mean, a Portuguese port, right? That's the point, a Portuguese neutral port. Then all of the Japanese nationals would disembark. Then the other ship would come from the US or from the UK. From the US or the UK, the Japanese nationals would disembark, and on the ship that comes from Yokohama, the Allied nationals disembark, and then you exchange them. And the same ships sail back or go back to Japan, and they did this route 3 times. Until it was impossible to get these exchanges done. It became more difficult to do the exchanges with the prolonging of the war. A, because the sea lanes of communication became much more dangerous. B, the more Japan came under attack, the harder it was for the Japanese government and the foreign ministry to get the military on board to let ships pass, because the military was obsessed with the idea that somebody would smuggle out intelligence that would help the enemy. That's why only 3 exchange ships, 3 trips could be organized. Thank you for that. And the other one, the Swiss banking system, yeah. The Swiss franc was at the end in 43, 44, 45, the last freely convertible currency in the world. So anything you want to buy on the world markets across these blocks of war needed to be paid either in gold or in Swiss francs. And that's quite significant as a means of payment. And the Swiss franc remained a neutral currency in which anyone could deal with. And the other thing is, and we didn't even discuss that, is the role of the Bank of International Settlement, located in Switzerland, in Basel, then evacuated further inward, that remained intact, and in which German, Italian, French, British, American, Japanese personnel was working during the entire time of the war, keeping payment systems alive. And the choice they made as a neutral financial institution, was that they would clear payments between members of the same bloc, Japan and Italy and so on, and Germany. The BIS would do clearance between them, and they would do clearing activities between the British and the Americans and the other, and the Soviet Union. Well, no, not the Soviet Union, because they never joined actually the bank. But that was their idea, right? The Swiss, on the other hand, the Swiss franc was freely convertible, which is one of the reasons why you could transfer the funds back and forth between enemy countries. Good for these countries and good for Switzerland. Yes.
I had a colleague some years ago, a Japanese American, who happened to be in Japan when the war broke out, and he couldn't come back to the U.S. And that reminds me, I think there were other cases, especially Japanese Americans or Japanese who had Japanese passports living in the U.S. I suppose a number would not want to go back to Japan because it was dangerous to live there, or they'd been Americanized. And how broad was that segment? Or what can you tell us about it?
This is, okay, the first thing I can tell you, there was by far more people who signed up for the exchanges than could be exchanged. That's the first one. The second one, this was an actual diplomatic problem for the Swiss. What do we accept the forced repatriation? Because there were certain Japanese nationals in the United States who didn't wish to be returned to Japan, but who Japan requested. We said we want them back, and then the question was, would you force them? And if I remember correctly, in the end they didn't. No forced returns, if I remember correctly. But that was a real question. What do you do with them? I'm not sure. I would have to look it up. Maybe they did.
My vague memory of this is you wouldn't call it forced, but they were children, Japanese nationals, who didn't speak very good Japanese, who had gone to American schools. These are the ones who didn't want to go back, but perhaps their parents did. So it was a messy situation.
Yes, yes. Very much. I mean, especially in the United States, you had this history of like even US nationals with Japanese heritage being then put into concentration camps, right? That was kind of worked out again in the 80s and 90s then, and for which the US government also apologized. And you had similar things happening in Japan, and this whole topic of internment camps and civilian and military is huge, and there's quite a broad literature about it, and it's quite dramatic on both sides, and also dramatic on the Asian continent, in the Philippines and in China, where a lot of people were incarcerated under very horrible conditions, and where like the neutrals had no access to them. Yes, please.
Thanks for everything so far, Pascal. By chance, I was just reading Dean Acheson's memoir about his days in the State Department during World War II. And one of his jobs was to organize the US efforts to stop the neutral countries from trading with Nazi Germany.
Yes.
Which is particularly, so the Spanish, the Swiss, and the Swedish. And for example, the Swedish industry could export high-quality products to Germany, such as ball bearings.
Yes.
And one of the ploys was that the Americans set up a firm which would buy all of the Swedish ball bearings. So this was it was arranged with the Swedes, so that there'd be a face-saving means by which they would sell all the ball bearings to the Americans. They wouldn't go to Germany. Unfortunately, the Swedish company responded to this by building a second factory.
Yeah, you increase demand, they increase supply, yeah.
So this infuriated the Americans, and they kept threatening dire consequences to the neutrals. But I just wondered, in light of everything you've been saying, were these the efforts, though, by the neutrals to help the Allies with their role as the protecting state? Was this a strong form of diplomatic leverage that the neutrals had to offset the problems they were having from the fact that they were trading so furiously with the enemy that way?
And, okay, what you're saying makes, of course, perfect sense. Both sides, the Germans and the US and the British, they all tried to keep the neutrals from trading with their enemies, because you don't want that, right? I mean, it's the enemy, it's the evil one. So, of course, you are not supposed to do that. And the neutrals, I mean, especially Switzerland and Sweden, both kept arguing, look, we have to trade with them if we are supposed to be trading with you. Plus, under international law, it's not forbidden. I mean, it's not only not forbidden, it's explicitly granted, including weapons. I mean, there's, as weird as it is, it's a different discussion, but trade with belligerents is something that's protected. And Switzerland and Sweden were both arguing that we have to trade with the other one. And the interesting one is that Switzerland at some point in 41, 42 was entirely encircled, but was still able to have shipments going to the United Kingdom with German agreement, because if we want to keep the services going, etc., and the relations intact, then we have to do that. But all in all, the Sweden and Switzerland did, to my knowledge, not threaten to break relations and to lay down their mandate. So what they did diplomatically and what they did economically, they kind of kept that separate. And about this story, you know, even in 1945, Swedish trade, about the Swiss we don't know, we lost these numbers. For 44, 45, we don't know what the trade with Japan was. But for the Swedes, we know there's a couple of 100,000 krona worth of trade that was happening in 45. What was that? piano wire that Stockholm or that companies in Stockholm managed to sell to Japan by transporting it on German submarines that then managed to go all the way over here. This piano wire was incredibly strong, so it was used for the wings of military airplanes. So there was a very high interest in buying these, and the neutrals, whenever, I mean, they just said this is private business that's going on, and they let it happen.
Thanks.
May I add one more thing just to that subject? As you know, Switzerland at that time, it was like an island totally surrounded by the Axis, the Germans, the Austrians, the French, taken over by the Germans, and Italy. So, and Switzerland was not self-sufficient in food. So there were a lot of those trades. And one of the trade was, for instance, and actually one of the board members of Sieber-Hegner at that stage was also negotiating with the German authorities about that. And so they would say, okay, we let 50,000 tons of wheat from the United States, we let that pass through Germany. Usually it came up on the Rhine River. And in return, you, Switzerland, you let 50,000 tons of coal from Germany to Italy without opening it, and it passes through the Gotthard Tunnel at that time, a very old one at that time. And the rumor was, it was not coal in it, actually, it was
Soldiers.
Soldiers or weapons and all kind of stuff. So that's why we were not allowed to open it up. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. So neutrality at that time, also being totally surrounded by the neutral enemy, was...
Although that's where I would contest you. I mean, you're surrounded by enemies with weapons.
Yeah.
You're surrounded by friends. You're surrounded by friends with weapons because you're not at war, right? So
Okay. The second point, I mean, we were talking about protecting the neutrality, and how did that work in Switzerland? Well, you had some table there, 1938 trade. That's actually the year I was born. I lived through the war from the Swiss perspective when I was in kindergarten. I mean, before that I didn't remember, but and I mean, Switzerland had about 500,000 soldiers protecting the borders, particularly the Rhine between Switzerland and Germany. And it had a deterrent effect that Germany did not attack Switzerland because they could move the stuff through Switzerland, and Switzerland threatened, if they are attacked, that they will blow all the roads, the bridges, the tunnels, they will all blow it up, and the access for Germany would be no longer possible. But I mean, my father was one of the 500,000, and he spent usually 1 or 2 days per month at home. In the meantime, his business went bankrupt because he was at the border and only got a very small salary from the army. So that was pretty tough. And the food, I mean, we started in the gardens. We started to grow potatoes to have some additional food which could be produced inside the country, because every ton of material or food coming from outside require terrible compromising on really, from a, let's say, from a more ethical point of view. No?
Yes.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And yes, you're right. I mean, the basic, when we talk about the neutrals in Europe, the basic the thought was be too expensive to occupy, but too valuable to lose. And thereby you can maybe keep yourself out of the war, right? So what I kind of, the thing that I would like just to add is the idea that neutrals were not supposed to trade with the Axis powers is just is a misunderstanding of the law of international law. The so-called law of neutrality explicitly says no, neutrals can trade. Because why did it say that? Because everybody could be neutral sometimes back in the 19th century and up until the Second World War. This is completely different today. But before the Second World War, everybody was neutral sometimes, just like Russia was, the Soviet Union was neutral with Japan occasionally. So the law of neutrality actually says, no, trade can go on. And the Swiss and the Swedes, the neutrals, they just did that because that's the natural thing to do. When you're at peace, again, you're surrounded by friends with weapons. This might turn into something bloody and bad, but at the moment, before you're at war, you're at peace, right? That's one thing, and then the other thing is, of course, how did the war happen in Europe? I mean, it became harder and harder for Switzerland, Spain, and Sweden to import anything from Germany or Italy, as these two were starting to lose the war because they needed all of their materials themselves, and then that's when it became precarious. So, yeah, I think that's just what I want to say. From the perspective of the neutral country, it is a weird thing to stop trading with a friend, even though the other friend says, let go, okay, don't do it anymore. It's like, yeah. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation and the invitation today, Professor. My question is about military activities. Did military forces make any effort not to kill the neutral countries' nationals when they attack enemy's city?
From which side? Like
any side, both sides.
I mean, so basically any neutral citizen outside of a neutral country is on the other one's enemy territory, and there is no war. It's not a war crime if they die, I mean, in international law terms. The only war crime would be targeting diplomats. And as far as I'm aware, is that both sides did not use diplomats at any point in order to extort something, neither from the neutral nor from the belligerent side. I mean, in Japan, for example, Ambassador Grew, the American ambassador, or Ambassador Craigie of the UK, they were kept relatively well. And their staff was kept in okay conditions, even though in their memoirs they complain incredibly a lot. What they went through is in no comparison to what their compatriots went through who were captured on the battlefield. So diplomats were kept pretty much in accordance to the protocol. Nationals, I can't answer, but thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. So something I learned today is it seemed to me that neutrality is especially important in symmetric conflicts, in conflicts where you have two or more powers that have kind of similar stakes and powers and which requires cooperation. However, I think the general criticism of neutrality and non-intervention in asymmetric conflicts, such as the Bosnian conflict, for example, is that if you're neutral towards a conflict such as the Bosnian one, you're supporting the stronger side, the strong party. And to which extent can you say that in today's world where, asymmetric conflicts are the norm, is neutrality maybe less relevant, on this, particular point? Thank you.
Thank you. The question is if in asymmetric wars, being neutral means the same as supporting the stronger party, right? And you're saying that this is in a symmetric war, you can balance, right, between these forces. No, the losing side will always complain that not helping them is equivalent to helping the winning side. Under any circumstances, there was. I mean, Switzerland in the 1990s was attacked and said, like, okay, you actually prolonged the war in Europe by 1 year because you didn't stop trading with Nazi Germany, brought forward by Swiss historian, which, well, is a different question, but not supporting either side militarily always has an impact. Franco in Spain would not have come to power had not the United States and basically the whole of liberal democratic Europe said we're going to stay neutral in this conflict, in the civil war in Spain. Franco was on the losing end because the democratically elected government of the Republicans in Madrid had all the weapons. But because everybody else, including the United States, said we're going to remain neutral, we're not going to provide even weapons, we're not going to trade with you anymore, and Hitler didn't keep to that, and Mussolini neither, and provided weapons, in the end, the civil war in Spain was decided in favor of Franco. So not acting actually undermines necessarily one of both parties, usually the losing party, if the other one has the upper hand. And that criticism is valid for any conflict, which is why if you look at conflict as one between good and evil, then there's no neutrality, because not being on the good side is equivalent to being on the bad side. So if that's the mindset of what war is about, neutrality doesn't make any sense. If the mindset is the 19th century, Clausewitz, war is the continuation of politics by other means, well, then it's a different question. Then suddenly you can position yourself and you have all legitimacy to just hashtag not my war. It depends on how you think about war, whether it's morally acceptable or not.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pascal. We've unfortunately reached the end of the show, but thanks. It was a wonderful presentation. We're extremely happy you were able to join us, and we hope you'll come back. So thanks again, and we'll see you all next week. We have other events, and we'll see you at our new location in September as well. Thanks again. And thank you to Anais and to all our staff for organizing this.